Rubin Singh, August 17th, 2014. I was 8 years old. I was entering first grade around that time. We lived in Maryland at the time, in the United States. In June in particular, I don't remember hearing too much about the violence, at least at those days, but I do remember a lot of activity around the Gurdwara at that time. A lot of very passionate speeches and a lot of very emotional speeches and a lot of contentious discussion around the Gurdwara at that time. So I can't say I remember the specific days of the attack, what happened. My parents didn't tell me too much about it back then, but I do remember a lot of discussion and a lot of activity around the Gurdwara. Well, I think there was this general concern, what's going to happen next. It was a lot of anger, a lot of frustration. I do remember that. But at that point, I think I was such a young child. My parents tried to keep me away from as much of that as possible. In November, we were at home in Maryland as well. That was a little different. Although my parents had tried to shield me away from what happened in June, in November, I do remember. After Indira Gandhi was assassinated, it was I remember my mom getting the phone call, and there was that sense of, to be honest, joy and relief that this person who has caused so much anguish and has done such a terrible thing to the Sikh Qawm, that she was no longer. There was that sort of joy, but at the same time, I was confused as a kid. This person was killed and everybody's happy, so it was hard for for an 8-year-old to process. But then I remember immediately afterwards, and this is such a typical story of an 8-year-old kid, that I had a soccer game that day, and my Indian friend, who we used to carpool to practice together, his mom called and said, we're not going to practice or to the game, and for whatever reason, we never associated with that family anymore. So that was a clear demarcation. I remember at that point, a lot of the Hindu friends and family friends that we had, there was a period of a time where we just didn't interact, and for some of them, we never really spoke to again. So that's when I probably started asking a lot more questions around them. So that was some of the events immediately after the assassination that I recall. Well, one more thing about the November is, although there was this confusing time, one thing that made it very clear was when my mom did get a call and she had found out that her chachaji in Delhi was his shop was burned down during the pogroms, and he was killed. And I remember, my mom in tears that night, and that's when I really said, I need to know what's going on here. And that's when they started to explain to me exactly what happened during the Darbar Sahib attack, what was happening during the pogroms. And I'd say over the next few weeks and months, as more news started coming in, and you'd see the pictures. I remember there'd be a lot of publications, and one of which that came later was the World Sikh News. This was sort of after the pogroms and the rise of militancy. We would get all these pictures in the mail or news articles in the mail of just these horrific pictures of these Sikhs who had been killed, whether it was through the pogroms or whether it was during the militancy movement. And that was a really interesting time in my life, because at 8, 9 years old, I didn't really have this deep connection with Sikhi. Although I went to camps, I went to Khalsa school, I didn't really have this connection at all to Sikh history, to Gurmani, to anything. But there was something during that period of time where I would see these images of all these Sikhs who were fighting, who were killed, and it made me wonder, what is it? What is it that they were fighting for? What is it that, although, I didn't necessarily, I wanted to be like everybody else as an 8-year-old growing up in the United States, but, what is it that they were trying to protect? What is it that they were trying to preserve? And sort of that curiosity, I would say, at an early age led me to try to understand more about my history. I think that was sort of the biggest driver. What was it about our culture, our tradition, that the Indian state found so, that they were in such fear of? And I think, and what were the Singhs and the Kaurs who were fighting at that time? What were they trying to protect? And so I think that drove me to learn a lot more about my history. Why did it happen? I think the way I look at 1984, it really you could trace it back to a few events. You could sometimes I've tried to trace it back to the Sikhs fighting for their rights and getting their share of the economic pie. Trace it back to the 70s. Well, you could trace it back to the partition and Sikhs not getting their full rights. But to me, the way I look at it, I trace it back to Guru Nanak. It's a history since day one. Guru Nanak Sahib has challenged the state, and that has always been a threat to whatever state that was, whatever government that was at the time, whatever religion that government might be representing at that time. We have always challenged the state. We have always, as long as the state is unjust. And so to me, I don't look at 1984 as an isolated incident at all. It's been our history since day one, that anytime there is unjust, anytime that there's a minority, whether it's us or another community that's being oppressed, Sikhs are going to fight for it. And for that, we're going to bear the brunt of that as well. Yeah, connecting that with 1984, that's something my wife and I talk about a lot. It was such an impactful thing for both of us. So, how do we convey that to our kids? And we've struggled with it a little bit. On one hand, we want to let them know about sort of just how intense the tragedy was, in the same way that the Holocaust survivors want to pass on, so they know that this should never happen again. On the other hand, we also want them to be inspired, because I think there's lots of things that they can be inspired from. During that time, there was that sense of, at least probably the only time I've seen in my life, where there was that sense of Panthik unity. I remember going to protests and demonstrations and seeing that sea of Kesari, and everybody was together. So I remember my dad taking Amrit around that time, and a lot of people, Amrit Sanchars was on the rise. People were showing their defiance and their solidarity with the Guru, by making a commitment. And so and of course all the personalities, Baba Jarnail Singh, General Shabeg Singh, Bhai Amrik Singh. So there were all these inspiring stories of courage and bravery, and I think that's what we are trying to now convey to our kids, that just like all these other battles that we learn about in Sikh history, this was the Battle of Amritsar that happened in June of 1984. And just like in Chamkaur, it was a handful of Sikhs that held the might of the army for several days. And that's something that we should be proud of, and something that we should recognize as part of our history, and celebrate that particular incident, on how bravely those Sikhs fought. I think the issue is even more basic. Here we are 30 years later, having our own small children. There's not even a connection with Punjab, really. And I think that's sort of the first step, to sort of connect with Punjab, to connect with the land, to understand its historical significance, to understand the economic issues. I don't think, working with children in the United States, that with Sikh children in the US at camps and retreats, there's a clear gap. So I think that's the first thing, to educate ourselves on exactly what were the socioeconomic problems of the time, and how those are the same now, and how they're in many cases a lot worse. So I think that's the first step. Responsibility to myself and others here is to make sure that people are educated on exactly what's going on and how bad things are. But then I think we have a lot of brilliant minds here, and entrepreneurial resources here. So I think that's sort of the next step. That what can we do either over in Punjab to help build the infrastructure, build the economy, build even Gurmat studies. What can we do there, or what can we do here that can help things? So I think we live in such a global world right now, or environment, that there's very easily things that we could do here that could help the economic situation, or the social, political, or even the Sikhi environment over in Punjab.